The late afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the small neighborhood market, painting golden streaks across the tiled floor. The hum of conversation and the faint squeak of cartwheels blended into a familiar symphony of ordinary life. Parents juggled shopping lists while children pleaded for candy. Elderly couples debated over brands of bread. It was the kind of unremarkable day that nobody would remember. Unless, of course, they happened to see Margaret. To the casual observer, Maggie was the picture of an unassuming grandmother. Her snow-white hair was carefully pinned back into a bun. Her cardigan hung loosely over a floral dress, and her hands clutched a knitted tote bag, bulging with yarn and the beginnings of a scarf. She shuffled slowly through the candy aisle, her cane clicking softly against the floor. But her eyes told a different story. Maggie's gaze darted from shelf to shelf, then to the mirror in the corner of the ceiling, and finally to the store manager stationed by the checkout. Her movements were deliberate, precise, almost surgical. She reached for a chocolate bar, paused, and then placed it back on the shelf as if reconsidering. But her fingers lingered just long enough to slide another bar into her bag. She repeated this twice more, the last time glancing toward the end of the aisle. A man in a leather jacket stood there, scanning the shelves. Maggie's posture stiffened for the briefest moment before she turned and shuffled away. Mrs. Margaret, the sharp voice of the store manager, sliced through the ambient noise. Maggie froze mid-step, her knitted tote swinging slightly. Slowly, she turned to face him, her weathered features twisting into an expression of confusion. "Oh, hello, Mr. Duncan," she said, her voice soft, trembling just enough to suggest frailty. Duncan marched toward her, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. He held out a hand, palm up. "Empty the bag." "Bag?" Maggie repeated, blinking rapidly. "Oh, heavens, have I forgotten something?" The growing crowd around them didn't miss a single beat. "She's stealing?" "Maggie, I always thought she was so sweet." "She probably didn't mean it, poor old thing." Maggie hesitated, her hand brushing over the top of her bag. "It's just I was going to pay for these, of course. I must have." "Don't lie to me," Duncan snapped, his voice rising. "I've had my eye on you for the past 5 minutes." The murmurs in the crowd swelled, and Maggie's cheeks flushed. She glanced around, her breath shallow, as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. A young woman in a denim jacket leaned toward her friend and whispered loudly, "People like her think they can get away with anything because they're old." A boy clutching his mother's hand looked up and asked, "Mommy, why's Grandma Maggie stealing?" "Hush, sweetheart," his mother replied, but her gaze carried a mixture of pity and suspicion. Maggie swallowed hard, her free hand tightening around the crook of her cane. Inside, her mind raced, calculating her next move. She cast one more glance toward the man in the leather jacket at the end of the aisle. He was gone. Her pulse quickened. The faint squeal of brakes outside announced the arrival of the police. "Let's not make a scene," Duncan said, though it was far too late for that. 2 officers entered the store, their presence commanding immediate attention. The taller of the 2, Officer Riley, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, we need to ask you to come with us." Maggie looked up at him with wide, glassy eyes. "But Come on now," Riley interrupted, his tone soft but firm. He gestured toward the door, and Maggie nodded, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world had settled there. As she shuffled past the onlookers, a man in a suit stepped forward. "She's just an old lady," he argued. "Is this really necessary?" But another voice shouted, "If she's stealing, she should be punished like anyone else." "Step aside," Officer Riley commanded, guiding Maggie out. Once outside, Maggie paused before climbing into the squad car. Her trembling hand brushed against the rim of her tote bag, and she adjusted the strap with surprising precision. Her eyes flickered toward a black SUV parked at the edge of the lot. The faintest smirk crossed her lips before she ducked into the car. The doors closed with a thunk, shutting out the noise of the murmuring crowd. As the car pulled away, Maggie stared out the window, her reflection blending with the scenery rushing past. She rested her toad on her lap, fingers drumming softly against it. Inside, hidden beneath skeins of yarn, lay a slim, rectangular device glowing faintly with red digits. "This wasn't part of the plan," she muttered under her breath. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the engine. "They're going to ruin everything." For the first time since the commotion began, her frailty disappeared entirely. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room hummed faintly, casting an unforgiving glow over Margaret's hunched figure. She sat with her hands folded neatly on the table, her cardigan replaced by a plain dress, her cane and bag confiscated. The stark surroundings made her appear even more frail, an elderly woman misplaced in a setting meant for hardened criminals. Through the one-way mirror, Officer Riley crossed his arms, his sharp eyes fixed on her. His younger partner, Parker, stood beside him, shifting uneasily. "She's got to be someone's grandmother," Parker said, his voice low but uncertain. "What are we even doing interrogating her? She's harmless." Riley didn't look away. Harmless people don't get themselves arrested for stealing chocolate bars and then act like they're in charge. There's something off about her. She could be confused. Maybe dementia. "Does she look confused to you?" Riley cut him off. He jabbed a finger toward the glass. "Look at her. Calm as a dam lake. I brought in gang members with more nerves than that." As if on cue, Maggie raised her head, her expression composed, her gaze landing squarely on the mirror as though she could see them. "Are you two just going to stand there gossiping?" she called out, her voice smooth and steady. "Or are you going to ask me some proper questions?" Riley's jaw tightened. "Let's see how harmless she really is." They entered the room, Riley leading the way with his usual air of authority. Parker trailed behind, carrying a folder and a skeptical look. "Mrs. Margaret," Riley began, pulling out a chair across from her. "Let's cut to the chase. We've got you on camera stealing. Just tell us what you were thinking." Maggie tilted her head, her hands resting lightly on the table. "I was thinking that those chocolates would make a fine gift for my granddaughter." Riley snorted. "Try again." "I simply forgot to pay," Maggie said, her voice laced with gentle patience, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "At my age, these things happen." "That's funny," Riley countered, leaning forward. "Because the store manager says he saw you hide them deliberately. He's willing to press charges." Maggie's lips curved into a faint smile. "Oh, Mr. Duncan always did have a flair for drama." "A bit of an overreaction, don't you think?" Parker frowned, shuffling through the folder. "Mrs. Margaret, we need the truth here. If you're honest with us, we can work something out. But lying? That'll only make things worse." For the first time, Maggie's calm demeanor cracked, just slightly. Her eyes narrowed, and her tone shifted, growing sharper. "Officer," she said, her gaze locking onto Parker with startling intensity, "you have no idea what's at stake here. If I hadn't been interrupted, none of this would even be a problem." "What exactly is at stake?" Riley demanded. Maggie hesitated, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet sigh, she leaned back in her chair, her hands now perfectly still. "I suppose there's no use pretending anymore." The room seemed to shrink as she continued, her voice steady, controlled. Was a field operative for an intelligence agency. My mission involved infiltrating the operations of a very dangerous man named Victor Kane." Riley raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You're telling us you're some kind of spy? At your age?" Maggie smirked. "Do you think spies retire with a pension and a gold watch? Some of us don't have that luxury." Parker shifted in his seat. "And what does Victor Kane have to do with chocolate bars?" Maggie's expression turned serious. "Those chocolate bars contain encrypted transmitters. I was gathering intel from a contact in the store. But your little intervention has likely alerted Kane's people. He's careful, paranoid. And now, thanks to you, he knows I've been compromised." Riley laughed incredulously. That's a hell of a story. Got any proof? Maggie's eyes flicked toward the evidence locker behind them. Why don't you check my bag again? Reluctantly, Parker retrieved the tote and dumped its contents onto the table. Yarn knitting needles and 3 candy bars. Riley picked one up, inspecting it with a frown. Looks like a regular candy bar to me. Peel back the wrapper, Maggie instructed. Parker grabbed a bar and carefully unwrapped it. Beneath the foil was a thin strip of circuitry, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. What the hell is this? Parker murmured, holding it closer. A transmitter, Maggie said. Designed to pick up low-frequency signals and encrypt them for secure transmission. They're nearly impossible to trace. Kane's people use them to communicate. Riley scowled. Convenient. But it doesn't prove your story. Before Maggie could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the room. Riley opened the door to find Captain Harris standing there, his face pale and tense. Riley. Parker. My office. Now. The 2 officers exchanged uneasy glances before following him out. Once inside the captain's office, Harris shoved a classified document across his desk. This just came in, Harris said, his voice low. A direct order from above. Whoever she is, we're to let her go immediately. Riley bristled. Sir, with all due respect, she could be lying. We don't even know who she's working for. Harris glared at him. You think I like this? I don't know who she is, but someone very high up does. And they don't want her here. Let her go, and don't ask questions. Back in the interrogation room, Maggie waited calmly. When Riley and Parker returned, her lips curved into the faintest smile. Well, she asked. You're free to go, Riley said begrudgingly. Maggie stood, collecting her things with deliberate care. As she reached for her bag, her hand brushed against the strap, adjusting something with practiced precision. Officers, she said, pausing at the door. If you want to stop Kane, you'll need to stop thinking like cops. Start thinking like him. Her gaze lingered on the corner of the room where a small security camera blinked red. She gave it a subtle nod before walking out, leaving the officers in stunned silence. The precinct buzzed with a subdued energy as Officer Parker stared at the unwrapped chocolate bar on his desk. The tiny strip of circuitry embedded in the foil shimmered under the fluorescent lights, a fragile yet undeniable piece of something much larger. Across from him, Riley sat back in his chair, his arms crossed and a skeptical frown plastered across his face. You're still hung up on that? For all we know, it's some gimmick. A toy from a spy shop or something. Parker leaned forward, his fingers tracing the foil edges. It's not a toy. You saw it yourself. She was telling the truth, at least about this. Riley snorted. So what? Even if she's legit, why do we care? She's out of our hands now. Parker shot him a sharp look. Because she's going after Victor Kane. And if she's right, he's more dangerous than anything we've dealt with before. The name alone was enough to make Riley hesitate. Victor Kane. The elusive businessman who wore a mask of legitimacy so well that no charges against him had ever stuck. There were whispers of coarse corruption, trafficking, even murder, but nothing ever concrete. Still, Riley wasn't ready to dive into the unknown on the word of an old woman. Before he could respond, the precinct phone rang. Parker reached for it instinctively, but the desk sergeant got there first. After a brief exchange, the sergeant gestured toward Parker. It's for you. Line 3. Parker picked up the receiver, his pulse quickening. Officer Parker speaking. A voice, crisp and authoritative, came through the line. Officer Parker, this is Director Lynch, Central Intelligence Division. I understand you've recently detained a Margaret Harris. Yes, sir, Parker said, sitting up straighter. Listen carefully. Maggie Harris is part of a classified operation. Her mission is critical and your department's interference has already jeopardized it. You and your partner are now tasked with assisting her. Consider this a direct order. The line went dead before Parker could respond. Riley raised an eyebrow. Who was that? Parker set the phone down slowly. The CIA? Riley rolled his eyes. Of course it was. And let me guess, they want us to babysit Grandma Spy. They want us to help her, Parker corrected. And if we don't, we're going to have more than Kane to worry about. As if summoned by their words, Maggie walked into the precinct at that very moment, her cane clicking against the floor. She wore her usual composed expression, but there was a new edge to her gaze, a sharpness that seemed out of place on someone so unassuming. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said with a small smile. "I trust you've had time to reconsider my offer." Riley gave a short laugh. "Offer? Is that what we're calling it now?" Parker stepped forward. "What do you need from us?" Maggie placed her tote bag on his desk and unfolded a blueprint. The intricate layout of the Sterling Hotel spread out before them, complete with marked exits, staff entrances, and a central ballroom. "Kane is hosting a gala tonight," she explained. "It's a cover for a meeting with his inner circle. I need to get inside and plant a surveillance device in the main conference room. And you can't do this alone because?" Riley asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. Maggie looked at him coolly. "Because I need to blend in. And nothing says harmless like an officer escorting his sweet old grandmother to a party." Riley opened his mouth to argue, but Parker cut him off. "I'll do it." "You will?" Riley looked at him as if he'd just sprouted a second head. Parker nodded. "She's right. This is our chance to get close to Kane. And if we don't take it, we might not get another." Riley hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. But if this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you." Later that evening, Parker stood near the valet station outside the Sterling Hotel, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. His nerves were raw, a mix of adrenaline and uncertainty coursing through him. The hotel loomed before him, its grand facade illuminated by soft, golden light. Guests in glittering evening were streamed inside, their laughter and conversation carrying faintly on the crisp night air. "Stop fidgeting." Maggie's voice came from behind him. Parker turned and froze. He barely recognized her. Gone was the cardigan and cane. In their place was a sleek black gown, pearl earrings, and a small clutch that rested lightly in her gloved hands. Her posture was regal, her presence commanding. "You," Parker started at a loss for words. Maggie smirked. "Clean up well, don't I?" She adjusted his tie with deft fingers. "Now, remember, you're my dutiful grandson, and we're here to enjoy a lovely evening. Blend in, keep your eyes open, and follow my lead." As they entered the grand lobby, Parker's breath caught. The opulence was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting fractured rainbows across the polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of perfume, expensive cigars, and power. Maggie's eyes darted across the room, taking in every detail. She leaned close to Parker. "See the man near the bar? Gray suit, gold watch." Parker followed her gaze. "What about him?" "He's one of Kane's top men. Keep track of where he goes." As they moved deeper into the ballroom, whispers about Kane floated through the crowd. "I hear he's arriving late tonight." "Typical. They say he never misses these events." "Did you see the extra security? Something's definitely going on." Maggie's expression remained neutral, but Parker could feel her tension. Her hand lingered on his arm as she guided him toward the back of the room. "Are we being watched?" Parker asked under his breath. Maggie's lips barely moved as she replied, "Always." At that moment, a tall man in a black suit stepped into their path. His sharp features and piercing eyes sent a chill down Parker's spine. "Evening, ma'am," the man said, his tone polite but laced with suspicion. "Good evening," Maggie replied, her smile disarming. The man's gaze flicked to Parker, then back to Maggie. "Enjoy the party." As he walked away, Maggie squeezed Parker's arm. "That was one of Kane's enforcers. He'll be watching us closely now. Do you think he suspects something?" Maggie's eyes hardened. "It doesn't matter. We're already in the lion's den. The only way out is through." She led Parker toward a side door, her steps steady but deliberate. Just as they reached it, Maggie glanced back, her gaze locking briefly with one of Kane's men standing by the entrance. The man's brow furrowed, his hand moving toward his earpiece. "We don't have much time," Maggie whispered. "Stay close." As the door closed behind them, the faint strains of the string quartet were replaced by the sterile hum of the service hallway. Parker felt his pulse quicken. "Are we going to make it?" he asked. Maggie gave him a small, knowing smile. "We don't have a choice." The dim service hallway was quiet again as Maggie and Parker made their way toward the conference room. Parker could feel the tension in the air, every sound amplified. The distant hum of the hotel's machinery, the soft click of Maggie's heels. "How much longer?" Parker whispered, glancing over his shoulder for any sign of pursuit. "Just ahead," Maggie replied, her voice calm but firm. She pulled a slim device from her clutch and held it up to the door's electronic lock. The device beeped quietly, the green light blinking to grant them entry. Maggie stepped inside first, her movements precise, her eyes scanning the lavish conference room. The space was a stark contrast to the industrial hallway they'd just left. Mahogany furniture gleamed under recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. "This is where it happens," Maggie said, moving quickly to the head of the table. She knelt and placed a small black device beneath the table's edge, her fingers deft as she activated it. "What's that?" Parker asked, keeping watch near the door. "A surveillance relay," Maggie explained. "It'll intercept communications during their meeting and transmit everything to a secure server. This is the evidence we need to tie Kane to his operation." Before Parker could respond, the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Maggie stiffened, her hand immediately reaching for her clutch. "They're here," she murmured. "Should we run?" Parker asked, his pulse racing. Maggie shook her head, her voice steely. "No. Running only makes you a target." The door swung open, and Victor Kane stepped into the room. He was tall, his tailored suit a masterpiece of black silk and subtle power. His presence filled the space before he spoke, his sharp gaze sweeping the room as if cataloging every detail. Behind him, two of his guards entered, their movements disciplined as they took up positions flanking the door. Kane's voice was smooth, tinged with menace. "Margaret Harris, I must admit I'm impressed. You've managed to survive longer than most." Maggie straightened, her posture defiant. "Victor Kane, still hiding behind henchmen, I see. Some things never change." Kane took a step closer, his measured movements exuding control. "Do you really think you've outmaneuvered me? I knew you were coming the moment you stepped into the hotel. My men have been watching you all evening." One of the guards smirked, holding up a small device. "We found your little trick," he said, tossing Maggie's transmitter onto the table. Parker's stomach sank. "What do we do now?" he whispered. Kane gave a low chuckle, his attention fixed on Maggie. "You've always been good, Margaret. But age catches up with everyone, even the best." Maggie's grip on her clutch tightened. "I've faced men like you before, Kane, and they all make the same mistake, underestimating me." The tension in the room was suffocating as Kane's smile faded. He raised a hand, and his guards moved forward, their weapons drawn. "Enough talk," Kane said coldly. "Time to end this." Maggie moved first. With a flick of her wrist, she threw a small sphere to the ground. A deafening bang echoed through the room as thick smoke erupted, shrouding everything in a dense cloud. "Stay close." Maggie's voice cut through the chaos as Parker fumbled for his weapon. The guards coughed and cursed, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze. Parker took aim, his training kicking in as he fired a shot that sent one guard's weapon clattering to the ground. The man lunged at him, and they grappled, the guard's strength overwhelming. From the corner of his eye, Parker saw Maggie. Despite her age, she moved with calculated precision, wielding her cane like a staff. One of Kane's guards charged her, but she sidestepped with surprising agility, slamming the cane into his ribs. "You're faster than you look," the guard growled, recovering quickly. "And you're slower than I expected," Maggie retorted, her tone razor-sharp. The second guard grabbed Parker by the collar, slamming him into the wall. Parker gasped for air, struggling against the man's iron grip. Maggie, spotting his struggle, swung her cane upward, its hidden blade flashing as it cut across the guard's arm. He howled in pain, releasing Parker, who quickly delivered a knockout punch. The smoke began to dissipate, revealing Kane standing calmly at the head of the table, his face a mask of cold fury. "Is this your big plan, Margaret?" he sneered. "Cheap tricks and an undertrained cop? You're out of your league." Maggie squared her shoulders, her breathing steady. "You're wrong, Kane. This isn't about me. It's about the people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed. And tonight it ends." Kane's gaze flicked to the corner of the room, where a blinking red light on the relay device caught his attention. His expression twisted into a snarl. "You think a recording will stop me?" he growled, lunging toward the device. Maggie moved swiftly, her cane snapping upward. At the press of a button, a dart shot out, embedding itself in Kane's neck. He staggered, his hand clawing at the projectile as his knees buckled. "Always so dramatic," Maggie muttered as Kane collapsed to the floor. Parker stared at her, his chest heaving. "You carry tranquilizers in your cane?" Maggie smirked. "You'd be surprised what I carry." The room fell silent, except for the labored breaths of the unconscious guards. Maggie knelt by Kane, checking his pulse before standing. "He'll live," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "But when he wakes up, he'll wish he hadn't." Parker's gaze shifted to the transmitter on the table. "Is it still active?" Maggie nodded. "It caught enough. His entire operation is about to unravel." Parker let out a breath of relief, but Maggie's expression darkened. "What's wrong?" Parker asked. "This is only the beginning," Maggie replied. "Kane's men won't go down quietly. They'll regroup, and when they do, they'll come for us." As if on cue, a faint vibration came from Maggie's clutch. She opened it to reveal a slim phone. A single message glowed on the screen. "They know." Maggie's jaw tightened. "We need to move. Now." The city streets felt tighter, darker, as Parker navigated the unmarked police car through traffic. Maggie sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the small screen of her phone. The glow illuminated her face, calm yet intense, as if the night's chaos had only sharpened her focus. "What did that message mean?" Parker asked, his voice tense. "It means we've disrupted something significant," Maggie replied, her fingers tapping rapidly on the screen. "And they're scrambling to recover. Kane's men aren't just coming for us. They're coming for the relay." "The data," Parker realized. She nodded. "The relay contains everything: shipping manifests, communications, blackmail records. If they erase it, the entire operation falls apart. We'll lose our only chance to dismantle Kane's network." Parker tightened his grip on the wheel. "So where are we going?" "A safe house," Maggie said. "It's off-grid and defensible. But it won't buy us much time." "Defensible?" Parker glanced at her. "You're expecting them to attack?" "They always attack," Maggie said simply. The safe house was a plain, nondescript building tucked away in the industrial outskirts of the city. Maggie stepped out first, scanning the area with practiced precision before nodding for Parker to follow. Inside, the space was sparse but functional. A single couch, a fold-out table, and a wall-mounted monitor displaying multiple security feeds. "This is cozy," Parker muttered, his voice tinged with unease. "It's not about comfort," Maggie replied. She moved to the monitor, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The relay's data began to upload, filling the screen with encrypted files. "It's about staying alive long enough to finish the mission." Parker sat heavily on the couch, watching her work. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Maggie paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Too many times to count." "So why keep going?" She stopped typing, her hands resting on the desk. For a moment, her expression softened, the weight of her past briefly visible. There was a mission, she began, her voice quieter. Prague years ago, a cell of operatives, good people, were exposed because we underestimated someone like Kane. I survived, but they didn't. Since then, I've made it my business to ensure no one like Kane gets that far again. Parker leaned forward, the respect in his eyes evident. And you think this data is enough to stop him? It's more than enough, Maggie said, turning back to the screen. But if they get to us before the upload completes, none of it will matter. A sudden ping on the monitor made her freeze. The security feeds showed movement, dark SUVs pulling up outside the safe house. They've found us, she said. Parker moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. Multiple vehicles, he muttered. Heavy weapons. They're not messing around. Maggie grabbed her clutch, pulling out a sleek handgun and tossing a second to Parker. We can't let them take the relay. Do we even stand a chance? Parker asked, checking the magazine. Maggie smirked faintly. We don't need to win. We just need to survive long enough. The first SUV door opened, and men in tactical gear poured out, their movements efficient and coordinated. One of them carried a compact machine gun, firing short, deliberate bursts into the air to intimidate. The rounds chewed through the concrete walls, like warnings of what was to come. Inside, Maggie activated a series of improvised traps. As the first wave breached the entryway, smoke canisters exploded, filling the space with choking clouds. Blinding flashes disoriented the attackers, forcing them to stumble blindly into the room. Parker crouched behind an overturned table, firing carefully at the intruders. These guys are trained, he shouted over the chaos. They're not just muscle, they're mercenaries, Maggie replied, her voice calm despite the bullets zipping past her head. Kane spares no expense when it comes to cleaning up his messes. One of the mercenaries spotted Maggie and aimed a shotgun in her direction. She dropped flat, rolling behind a pillar just as the blast tore through the air. Shards of wood and plaster rained down around her. You okay? Parker called out, taking down another assailant with a clean shot. Still breathing, Maggie said, her tone clipped. She sprang up, firing twice, and hitting the shotgun-wielding mercenary in the leg. He dropped with a howl of pain. Another attacker lunged at Parker, knocking the gun from his hands. They grappled, the man's strength overwhelming. Parker gasped for air, his vision swimming as the mercenary's arm tightened around his throat. Parker down, Maggie shouted. Without thinking, Parker dropped flat as Maggie threw a small object toward them. The mercenary barely had time to react before it exploded, releasing a burst of electrified darts. He collapsed, twitching, as Parker scrambled back to his feet. Thanks, Parker panted. Don't mention it, Maggie said, her eyes already scanning for the next threat. The fight stretched on, each moment more desperate than the last. The walls were riddled with bullet holes, the air thick with smoke and tension. Maggie and Parker were pinned near the monitor, the relay's progress bar slowly inching toward completion. We're running out of time, Parker said, his voice taut. I know, Maggie replied. She glanced at the monitor, her expression grim. If they destroy the relay, everything we've worked for is gone. The largest mercenary, a towering figure with a scar across his jaw, stepped forward. His movements were slow and deliberate, his confidence palpable. You've got nowhere left to run, Harris, he called out, his voice deep and steady. Give up now, and maybe Kane will let you live. Maggie stepped out of cover, her gun raised. I've heard that one before, she said. The mercenary smirked, aiming his rifle at her. Before he could fire, Maggie pressed a button on her wrist, triggering the final trap. A concealed charge detonated above him, sending heavy debris crashing down. He collapsed under the weight, his rifle clattering uselessly to the ground. The last of the mercenaries retreated as sirens wailed in the distance. Maggie and Parker leaned against the battered wall, their breaths ragged. "We did it," Parker said, looking at the monitor. The progress bar flashed 100% before the screen went dark. Maggie nodded, though her expression remained serious. For now, she moved to the relay, pulling a slim drive from its port. Handing it to Parker, she said, "This is our leverage. Protect it with your life." Parker took the drive, his hand trembling slightly. "And what about Kane's men? They'll regroup?" "They always do," Maggie replied. She glanced at her phone, where a new message had appeared. "Next target, Paris." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "But we'll be ready." As they slipped into the night, leaving the smoldering safe house behind, Parker glanced at Maggie. "You ever think about retirement?" Maggie smirked. "Every day. But then I remember why I'm still here." The screen in the ruined safe house flickered back to life. The final message blinking in bold text. "Relay transmission confirmed. Operation ongoing." The dawn broke over the city, its soft light washing away the chaos of the night before. Maggie and Parker sat in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, a stark contrast to the gunfire and smoke they had left behind hours earlier. Maggie stirred her coffee, her movements unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world. Across from her, Parker picked at a plate of scrambled eggs, his exhaustion written in the dark circles under his eyes. "You're quiet," Maggie said, breaking the silence. "I'm still trying to process everything," Parker admitted. "The fight, the data, Kane, all of it." He paused, looking up at her. "And you? You took down a group of mercenaries with a cane and a few gadgets. How do you even—" "Decades of practice," Maggie said with a small smile. "And a lot of mistakes." "Not last night," Parker said, shaking his head. "You were flawless." "Far from it," Maggie replied, her gaze drifting to the window. "I should have anticipated their response faster. We were lucky to get out of there alive." Parker frowned, setting down his fork. "Do you always see it like that? As something you could have done better?" "It's the only way you survive in this line of work," Maggie said, her tone serious. "You never stop looking for what you missed, because one day, what you missed could kill you, or worse, someone you care about." The weight of her words hung between them. Their conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Maggie's phone. She pulled it from her pocket, her expression unreadable as she scanned the message. "It's from the relay," she said, sliding the phone across the table. Parker leaned in to read the message. "Paris. Warehouse District. Confirmed shipment. 12 a.m. local." "Paris," Parker said, sitting back. "That's our next target, isn't it?" Maggie nodded. "Kane's network is global. Last night's operation was just one piece. If we're going to dismantle it, we need to stay ahead of them." "You make it sound so easy," Parker said with a faint smile. "It's never easy," Maggie said. "But it's necessary." As they left the diner, the world outside felt eerily normal. People hurried to work, traffic hummed along the roads, and the faint smell of fresh pastries wafted from a nearby bakery. It was hard to believe that beneath the surface, a war was being fought. "You know," Parker said as they reached the car, "most people would have walked away by now, taken the win, and left the rest for someone else to handle." Maggie gave him a sidelong glance, her smile tinged with sadness. "And how many of those someone else's do you think would finish the job?" Parker didn't have an answer. Maggie opened the car door, pausing to look at him. "You don't have to come with me, Parker. You've already done more than most would." Parker hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "I'm in. Someone has to watch your back." Her smile grew, a rare warmth breaking through her usual cool demeanor. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get." The car disappeared down the highway, heading toward the next chapter of their mission. The stakes were higher, the danger greater, but Maggie and Parker were ready to face whatever came next. Back at the safe house, amidst the wreckage, a lone figure sifted through the debris. He picked up the shattered remains of a monitor, his sharp eyes narrowing as he inspected the faint imprint of the relay's final transmission. Paris, the man muttered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Let's see how far you can run. Margaret Harris. The camera panned to a phone in his hand. On the screen was a message from an unknown sender. Activate protocol Nemesis.